to the Niche Pursuits Podcast. Are you ready to discover some niche business ideas that actually work? Well, it's time for a motivational kick to jumpstart your next big idea. Here's your host, Spencer Haas.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Niche Pursuits Podcast. I'm Spencer and I'm going to be your host. I will actually be the solo voice on the episode today. You know, it's been a little while since I've recorded a podcast episode. I'm actually going to address that today and discuss the reasons why it's been a little while and actually what the future of the podcast is going to be. The core topic of today really is centered on a decision that I had to make whether or not to actually hang up this podcast or to continue moving forward with it. And so I'm going to go into what my original opinion was and what my opinion is now. It's often very difficult to allow your opinions to evolve. And unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you're looking at it, that's what happened to me. And it all is regarding the fate of this podcast. That's right, this podcast. And so stay tuned for what my decision was. As a little hint, you are listening to my podcast right now. Also, towards the end of the show, I'm going to share what books I'm reading right now, and also an interesting documentary that I just recently watched. I thought you might find that interesting, so go ahead and stay tuned to after the official episode. Now let's jump right into it. So what happened? You see, about a week and a half to 2 weeks ago, I actually wrote a very in-depth blog post on nichepursuits.com that is still up, and you can, of course, go and read that if you haven't read it yet. But the title was, Why You Should Not Start a Podcast. And you have to understand, I wrote this out of my own frustration for a lot of reasons. And I want to discuss some of those reasons, which I did, of course, in the blog post. But my reasons or my decision about why you should not start a podcast has evolved. And I also want to take the bigger picture look and as to how you can apply this into your own business. We all have our own opinions, whether that's business related, personal related, politics, religion, everything. We have opinions and beliefs and decisions that we've made based on various reasons. And when we're confronted with data or other possibilities, it's often really, really difficult to change our minds. And I ended up changing my mind after writing this blog post for a few reasons, which I want to talk about today. So in my original post, Why You Should Not Start a Podcast, I wrote a few things about, the results that a podcast generates. In particular, I was frustrated because for the very first time, I had been sponsored on somebody else's podcast for Longtail Pro, the software that I own. And so I did a short sponsored spot on that show, and that show got listened to a couple of thousand times. And of course, I had set up a tracking link so that I could know how many people had actually clicked on that. So it's been a couple of weeks now since that podcast aired. And so I checked my stats. And so out of thousands and thousands of listens, I went back, and do you know how many people actually clicked that link? 7. It was only 7 people. So you can see I'm like, podcasts maybe aren't really effective for getting people to click on links. Then the other piece of data that I looked at for a reason why podcasts are not generating great results is my own podcast. There's been a time or two where I've mentioned specific links for you, the listener, to go and visit if you wanted more information on a certain topic. For example, I did this for the Niche Site Project too. And so let me see if I can find the actual numbers here. But it had been listened to over 7,000 times, 7,724 total downloads of one particular podcast that had a tracking link in it. And out of all of those listens, the number of people that had visited that link was only 70. And so you can see my extreme frustration for the results that were generated by a podcast. And so that was sort of reason number one why I was so frustrated. Another reason that I have been frustrated with podcasting is just the interviews are so time consuming, in the fact that I need to schedule them ahead of time, work out questions ahead of time. And really, one thing that I didn't mention in my blog post that I maybe hinted at in my blog post is that, I do all my recording out of my home. And because I have 4 children, there's only a limited number of hours that I can actually sit down in front of the microphone where the house is completely quiet and get it done. And so if I'm required to schedule things ahead of time, I don't always know if my house is going to be empty and if there's going to be a quiet house. And so it can be a little bit nerve-wracking. And in addition, you've listened to my interviews. I'm perhaps not the best interviewer on the world. Of course, I could become better at that with practice, but it's just not my forte. And I stated here in my blog post that, well, I'd rather be analyzing spreadsheets, to be honest, than to interview somebody. And, that is very true. But I wasn't considering all angles of my podcast. And so I had to write a follow-up post because something interesting happened after I did my original post. Immediately, the comments started pouring in. People started writing in saying, "Hey, Spencer, I did find you through your podcast. That was the original source that I found you." And this is something that I didn't know before. I wasn't able to track results. And I should back up and say that was the other big reason that I had sort of was having a little bit of a downer with podcasting, was I didn't know if all the listeners were coming from nichepursuits.com, my existing readers. Was I actually generating any new listeners, any new readers from my podcast? There really is no easy way to track that data. And so when the comments started pouring in saying, "Hey, we actually did find you. That's the first place that we heard of you, was through your podcast." This was really an eye-opener for me. And so I want to just read a couple of those comments that people had, and just to give you an idea of what ultimately changed my mind here. First was a comment by David. It says, "Hello, Spencer. I first found your blog after downloading a number of random podcasts from iTunes and listening to yours. In my opinion, hearing somebody talking to you on a podcast makes you much more likely to visit their site on a regular basis than it does from reading a blog post. Hearing the person talking also makes you feel more trusting of them. I would be much more likely to buy a product such as Longtail Pro from your site than I would from a site and owner who I had never heard speak. While podcasts may not dramatically increase the clicks you get, I definitely think they improve your trust and reputation you have and probably make your existing site visitors more likely to buy your products from you." Wow. That actually was a big eye-opener for me. And it wasn't just that there was one comment. I sort of figured that there would be one or two, or maybe a few people that commented and said, "Hey, we actually did discover you through your podcast." But it turns out, there's 130 some odd comments on this blog post now. Probably almost half of those are people saying, "Hey, either I did find you through your podcast, or it's because of your podcast that I trust you more and I visit your website more, or I bought Longtail Pro, or for whatever reason, I have more trust in you now." And so, again, that was sort of an aha moment for me, something that I hadn't realized previously. I'm going to take a quick drink break here. Hold on just a second. So again, after writing that blog post, a number of things happened. In addition to just those comments that I read, was actually a response from the podcast answer man himself, Cliff Ravenscraft. He made a comment and eventually did a follow-up podcast almost as a rebuttal to what I had written. And he found some weaker arguments, I guess you might say. Some of the points I made were a little bit weaker. And he had some great advice. And that helped me change my thinking a little bit more. In addition, finally, the last thing that I did is I went and I looked at the actual data from the number of downloads and the actual page views on my site. And I'm going to share those here in a second. All of that made me change my mind a little bit about podcasting. So I went ahead and I wrote a follow-up blog post called "Maybe You Should Start a Podcast After All." And this blog post basically reviews what I just told you, what I had written in my previous blog post. But I kind of recap and say, okay, you know what? I actually only gave 2 good reasons why maybe you shouldn't start a podcast. One of those, if you really do not enjoy podcasting, if you don't enjoy sitting down and talking and sharing your thoughts, maybe you shouldn't start a podcast. Also, if you genuinely don't have the time. And this is a big one for me because I felt like I didn't have time. But those really are the only 2 good reasons. I also kind of clarified some of the weaker arguments that I had made, such as, you can't track if you're getting new listeners, podcast listeners don't take action, the fact that I don't like scheduling and conducting interviews. All of those things were really weaker points that I made. However, the pros of starting a podcast are really, really strong. First of all, there's the networking benefits that are huge. You can meet a lot of people that you wouldn't meet otherwise. You can learn for free from others by conducting interviews if you decide to do that. Podcast listeners also engage for a longer time with your content. So, I want to thank all of you for listening to my podcast a little bit longer than you would reading my content on my blog. That's just how it works. In addition, you can also build significant trust through a podcast and with your audience that you can't do quite as easily through other means. You can also stand out as an expert in your field. And finally, a successful podcast can really lead to other opportunities, whether that's speaking at conferences, other business opportunities, writing books, or just generally having a bigger platform for which you can share your influence, whatever that may be. So also in this blog post of why you actually should start a podcast, I kind of shared some of my deeper thoughts as to why I had been so frustrated. And the first reason, and it's a very real reason, was that you have to understand that my business is actually already doing very well. I'm making more money right now than I ever thought I would be 3 years ago. Business has been growing, doing very well. And so I sort of had the thought, why do I need a podcast? My business is growing. It's doing well. Is this podcast really helping at all? So that was sort of one frustration. Another frustration is that, about a month ago, I actually had child number 4 that my wife and I welcomed into the Haas household. And so we had a baby boy. He's doing very well. But it also means that, he gets up every few hours and is crying at night. And just with 4 children overall, I'm really strapped for time. I'm fighting between spending more time in my business versus spending more time with my family. And so, I need to find a balance there. And the podcast wasn't fitting in really well with the interviews. So that was another frustration. Third, I had just received 3 or so requests in the past couple of weeks from people that wanted to be on my show and wanted to be interviewed. And when I thought about scheduling and thinking about, I've already got this full-time business, I have 4 kids and I have a wife that need attention, I'm not seeing a lot of action from my podcast. Do I really have the time and energy to schedule even more interviews? And then again, another reason I mentioned is just the fact that maybe conducting interviews isn't my forte. And then 5th, I had already been sponsored on another podcast. And after that first ever spot, I really didn't see hardly any clicks. I didn't see anything happening from that sponsored spot. So I sort of threw my hands up in the air in frustration and said, you know what? Forget it. Podcasts are just not worth it. I figured, you know what? I will just keep doing a podcast maybe once every other month and call it good. However, I learned some powerful lessons from my readers. Those comments were huge. So if you were somebody that left a comment on my last blog post, thank you. Thank you so much for opening my eyes. I already read one from David. Here's another one from Ben. Says, sort of says it's a well-informed article. He says, I feel like the main value for many podcasters is having your audience get to know you on a deeper level and ultimately growing trust in a way a blog post never could. I can only speak for myself, but I don't think I ever bought one of your products before I heard you on a podcast. I think I've bought 2 since. Podcasts don't always have to be interviews, although many feel much more comfortable interviewing someone than just talking for 30, 60 minutes. I think trust can also be built with YouTube videos or short audio recordings on your site, not just hour-long podcasts. Ultimately, I agree with pretty much everything you wrote, but think you may have slightly shortchanged the effect your podcast has had on your business. I hope you keep doing it. And well, as you can see, I am still doing my podcast. I'm recording right now. Jason also said, hi, Spencer. I'm one of those people who found your blog through the podcast. I've really enjoyed the podcast you've produced and listened to them more than once. I'm soon to be in need of more hosting and Longtail Pro, so when I use your affiliate links and purchase Longtail Pro, you can chalk it up to sales from your podcast. Your blog is great too. Thank you, Jason. And it goes on and on. Like I said, there was just dozens and dozens of comments. And really, it's one difficult thing that I need to just accept about podcasts is that it is difficult to get quick feedback from listeners as far as links tracked. I know that you're out there listening right now. You're doing other things most likely. You're out jogging, working at another job, you're driving your car, you're pushing your stroller with your children or whatever. And you can't just stop and click a link or leave a comment. And so I need to realize that, which I do. And I've always known that, but it makes a lot more sense why there's less action, if you will, out of a podcast than just a regular blog post. Now, Cliff Ravenscraft, he recorded a 2-hour-long rebuttal to my podcast. And I actually want to give a big shout out to him because he took the time and he had a lot of great things to say. I have no complaints, even though it was basically a 2-hour-long tongue lashing, if you will. I say that a little bit facetiously. He actually said it very kindly, and it was very nice, but he just pointed out some of the reasons that podcasts are very good. A couple of the points that he made that were very excellent for me to reconsider is, first, he said, podcasts don't have to be interviews. You know what? I actually had somehow pigeonholed myself into thinking that in order for me to publish a podcast, I needed to be interviewing somebody, and that's just what a podcast was. And so if I think about, if I can just sit down and record my own thoughts without having to schedule and find the right time, and just I can do it when I have time and the house is quiet here, it makes it so much easier. And so I want to thank Cliff for that piece of advice. Second, he said, if I were more consistent with my podcast, rather than skipping entire months like I have, then I would see bigger results. I probably already knew that, I suppose, but he made it very crystal clear, just the exponential benefits that I could see with growing my audience and probably building a deeper trust if I was producing podcasts on a more consistent basis. And I'm going to talk about how consistent I'm going to try and get here in just a minute. Now, also he said that a podcast listener is much more valuable than a website visit. That definitely is true. And I had really never thought about that. I look at the amount of traffic that I get to my blog, which is thousands of visitors a day, and the amount of traffic I get to my podcast, which is, right now is maybe 200 people a day listening to my podcast. And so I sort of think, well, everything's happening at my blog. But the reality is that all of you listening out there, and I want to thank you again, that are listening for an hour or more sometimes. Whereas if you're reading my blog, you're there for 5 or 10 minutes tops usually. You read the blog post and you move on. And so the amount of time that you're listening to me helps you to get to know me a little bit better, helps build the trust a little bit better, and all of those benefits that we mentioned. So again, thank you, Cliff, for responding to my last blog post. And then finally, I did some deeper analysis on my own stats, and I want to share what I learned. So basically, what I did is I went to my Libsyn stats. That's just where I can see how many people have downloaded my podcasts and each episode. And I got the totals for how many downloads corresponded to each episode. And then what I did is I went to my Google Analytics and I looked at the amount of page views each of the corresponding blog posts had that were related to that podcast episode. So what I do when I record an episode, so my last episode was number 27, How to Grow a Mustache.com with Douglas Smith. So I post that podcast onto iTunes, but also at the same time, I write a blog post on nichepursuits.com that outlines that podcast, and I post that. And so I was assuming that most of the podcast listeners were already Niche Pursuits readers, and so I assumed I was getting more traffic on nichepursuits.com, more page views on those episode blog posts, and that was driving the listens to the actual podcast itself. And so when I listed these numbers side by side, the total downloads on iTunes versus the total page views on nichepursuits.com for each corresponding episode, and there's 27 episodes. This will be the 28th that I'm recording now. I was in for a bit of a surprise because out of those 27 episodes, only four had more page views on nichepursuits.com. So in other words, a lot more downloads and listens are happening outside of my existing blog on nichepursuits.com. And that was a big eye-opener because I had always been looking for a way to track if I'm reaching a new audience. So let me just share a couple of numbers from a couple of episodes. So my last episode, number 27, How to Grow a Mustache.com, has been downloaded 5,308 times. However, the corresponding blog post on nichepursuits.com has only had 2,431 page views. So over double the amount of listens have happened on iTunes with the podcast versus the amount of page views. The same thing is basically true for my episode 23, How to Build Links the Right Way with John Cooper. It's been downloaded 7,383 times. But on nichepursuits.com, that corresponding blog post has only been viewed 3,946. And I could go on and on and on through all 27 of those, but I think you get the idea. Overall, Total downloads, about 192,000 for the podcast. Total page views, 115,000. So, I had to do a little bit of an about face because the data was clearly speaking to me saying, you know what, your opinion was wrong about podcasting. You are reaching a new audience. People are engaging with that content. And in fact, you're reaching people that never even go and look at nichepursuits.com. And to clarify, I get way more page views than 115,000 on nichepursuits.com because I have about 300 blog posts there. But out of these 27, that's how many page views I get. And the podcasts just get downloaded more per episode. And so, have you ever had an opinion that you once firmly held that after looking at the data, you had to change your mind? And in particular related to business. Well, that happened to me. It doesn't happen a lot. I'm happy to say that I am going to continue recording podcasts. And in fact, I'm going to put in much greater effort now to be more consistent. Because I can see that and it's not just about the numbers. I'm not just concerned about getting more downloads and reaching a new audience and growing my business. What I'm actually more concerned about, and what I was reading from the comments, was how interested people were in hearing my story. And some of the comments were just saying how much my podcast has actually helped them. And if I'm able to share my experiences with my business and what's brought me some success, if others can take that and apply that to their business and see some sort of incremental success as well, then that does it all. Whether it's thousands of listeners or it's just one. If one person takes some piece of advice that I give and it brings them success, then me sitting down for an hour on this episode or whatever and recording it, that's all the benefits that I need to see. That's really what I'm hopeful for, is that just something that I say can influence somebody else for the better. I'm going to take a quick drink break here. I'll be right back. So how consistent am I going to be with my podcast? This is something that you may have noticed. I've been pretty inconsistent, never really had a regular schedule. But now, starting with this episode, I am going to be more consistent. In my last blog post, I pledged that I was going to record a weekly episode. That's right. So you can tune in now to the Niche Pursuits podcast once a week. And I'm guaranteeing that I do it for at least 90 days. So I'm going to record at least 12 episodes for 12 weeks in a row. And then I'm going to reevaluate just how it's going. And if I need to step that back to maybe bi-monthly, twice a month, or if I can continue doing that weekly, I will. But I wanted to at least guarantee that, hey, I'm going to do 12 episodes for 3 months, and then I'm going to see how it goes. I have every intention to continue doing weekly episodes, and so that I hope that does continue. And just for a small plug for the Niche Pursuits podcast, one way for me to know if you're getting any value out of this podcast, and as encouragement for me to continue going forward, is if I get any ratings or reviews back from you. So if you found any value in this podcast or any previous podcasts, I'd love it if you went over to iTunes, just left a quick rating and review if you found any value there. So if you just Google the Niche Pursuits podcast in iTunes, you can find it there. Or if you go to nichepursuits.com/iTunes, that will take you to the ratings page, as well where you can do that. So overall, the lesson learned from me, and maybe a lesson that can be learned from you, is not to allow your frustrations and your emotions drive your opinions and decisions. I allowed a little bit too much of that to drive my decision to write this big blog post saying why people should not start a podcast, when really I should have based my decision more on data and the feedback that I was receiving. Because when I went ahead and looked at the hard numbers for amount of traffic coming to my podcast and the amount of influence I was seeing, that really has allowed me to see the true value of my podcast. And so you should look more at the data rather than just relying on emotions or frustrations to make those decisions. So I want to thank you for listening in to this episode. It's been a little bit different, no interview, just a solo podcast, but I've hoped you have enjoyed it. Now I'm going to actually share 2 books that I'm reading right now. Let me grab that here. So the first one, I actually just finished this one. It's called The Education of Millionaires: Everything You Won't Learn in College About How to Be Successful. It's by Michael Ellsberg. And it was actually a pretty good book. I enjoyed it. It covers a lot of successful people, a lot of their stories, and how basically they found an alternate route to making money, as opposed to the traditional route of going to college, getting a degree, and working your way up through the ladder of corporate America or whatever. And so for you that is entrepreneurial minded, like I know you are because you're listening to this podcast, maybe that's nothing new, but it covered all kinds of stories of people that never finished college, that started ventures, and through their hustle and salesmanship and marketing and brand building and whatever, they were able to do very, very well. So I found it good. I recommend it. It's very, very good. It was a little heavy on the argument against college. It argued very strongly that, hey, you really shouldn't go to college. It makes some good points, and I'm not going to disagree necessarily, but going to school can still be a good route for some people if they just don't have that business idea. So anyways, good book, recommended. The next one is Startup Communities: Building an Entrepreneurial Ecosystem in Your City by Brad Feld. I'm not quite done with this one yet. Maybe I'll be done with it by the next time I record a podcast episode, but it's good for kind of developing a blueprint for a local startup community within your city or local area. And it documents and reviews what has happened in Boulder, Colorado, which is where Brad Feld is from, where there's a very vibrant startup community there, and how they've made that happen. I'm in the state of Washington, in the Tri-Cities, and there's a few entrepreneurs and other people that have been reading this book and really been talking about what we can do here in the Tri-Cities to build a more vibrant and strong startup community. I've attended a couple of the events, including a startup weekend a few months ago, and a couple of other things that, we'll see how it goes. I'm trying to get more involved locally. I do everything. My entire business is online. I have my blog, and I have Longtail Pro, and I'm doing the podcast. And very few people in my own city really know that, I'm even here, I guess. I'm not involved. I just don't have to be. Everything I do is virtual. But I'm trying to take a little more active role in my actual community here. I'm joining a mastermind group, if you will. We're going to be meeting every couple of weeks. And I'm going to try and mentor a few people there with their own businesses here in the Tri-Cities. So anyways, I'm partway through the book. It's pretty good. I'll give you a stronger opinion one way or another once I actually finish it. Overall, that's it for today. I hope you've enjoyed the podcast very much, and I hope you go out there and make your own business ideas a reality. Thank you very much.